So what are the strongest and weakest Warhammer 40k armies in 10th edition right now? Let's do a tier list of all the units currently in the game and what's making them either good or bad. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought I'd take the time to make a proper Warhammer 40k tier list. Over the past few months or so I have made a few videos focusing on some factions at the top or bottom of the meta and looking at some win rates, but I thought it was high time to redo the full tier list video, given that the last one that I made was a bit predictive after the balanced data slate. For this one we'll talk through the strongest and weakest armies in Warhammer 40k as they stand currently, and of course in my opinion to some extent. The majority of the tier list will as always be led by tournament results, win rates and the amount of events that the factions are taking down primarily, and we'll take a look at their stats as they go along. And generally from those numbers I've split up the factions into 6 different tiers, based on those with a little bit of my own discretion and opinion. Overall at the moment in Warhammer 40k I feel like the game really isn't in too bad a shape. Even the weakest factions in the game at least have win rates in the low 40s as opposed to the low 30s of which we had before. And while the top things in the meta are a bit oppressive, it's not quite as crazily dominant as it was previously. It perhaps puts things in a good place for Games Workshop's next big balance pass, which will be happening in January, where hopefully we'll get some tweaks to the weakest and the strongest stuff around, and a bit better internal balance for a whole bunch of stuff in the middle, where some armies that are absolutely fine power-wise just feel a bit sad with the units that they can credibly take into battle. In any case though, let's go through each army in turn, starting with the ones that are ranked weakest and moving forward to the strongest, talking through tournament stats, some standout units and rules from their index or codex, and any issues that they might be facing in-game right now. First up, we'll start with Tier 6, the armies that I'd rank as struggling the most in Warhammer 40k right now, and at the moment in this tier I'd rate Adeptus Custodes and Drukhari, and also the Imperial Knights. At the moment with win rates and tournament results it does look like these guys are the ones that are struggling most in the game. Starting off we have the Drukhari. Tournament win rates are around 43% and 2 big event wins since the balanced data slate, though even with those one of them was a bit of an oddball event, and the other one I think was Mr. Scary who managed to pull off a gambit during the missions, a mechanic that guarantees that it's got quite a big element of luck built into it to start with. People aren't really particularly excited to play Drukhari at the moment. They're one of the most niche factions in 40k anyway, but particularly lowly represented right now, 25th most played out of the 26 factions in the game. Army rules wise, they get their power from Pain, which is the ability to generate Pain tokens and plug it into units for damage and rerolls. Real Space Raiders might get you 1 or 2 extra Pain tokens depending on how many HQs you brought, and for the stratagems they get a few movement shenanigans, and a -1 to wound for some covens and things. I would say that the Real Space Raiders detachment maybe isn't the most exciting. For their strongest units currently it tends to be anything with Dark Lances. Ravagers and Void Ravens are very good, Scourges with Dark Lances are staples for their move shoot move, plus maybe some Mandrakes to score objectives, Kronos are really tanky for the points, and Talos Pain Engines and maybe some Cabalites in Raiders or Venoms tend to make their appearance in the battle line, pushing the front line and scoring objectives. Drukhari are definitely an army with lots of issues that Games Workshop could choose to address in a number of different ways in the balanced data slate. They're still weirdly oddly ranged focused, with Lances being extra good. A few more melee buffs for things like Witches or Incubi could be nice, however they choose to realise them, maybe making Pain tokens extra nasty on melee units perhaps. Currently their detachment rule really adds very little to them as well, so it could be nice to improve that in some way. And I've got plenty of issues with the core rules for fly and transports not interacting quite as well with terrain, or not allowing as many special rules when embarked. I think fortunately though Games Workshop definitely will have their eye on them, being arguably one of the weakest factions in all of 40k. I certainly expect some improvements on the way. Also not faring so well at the moment are the Adeptus Custodes, pretty much the polar opposite of Drukhari playstyle wise, but also languishing on a win rate of 43%, 0 bigger event wins since the balanced data slate that I've seen. They're still kind of popular as they're just a very well and widely collected faction, pretty easy to jump into and not too hard to grasp playstyle wise. Custodians tend to fight with big tough infantry, putting the smack down in melee with damage to melee weapons, big invulnerable saves, 2+ armor saves and hitting on 2+s in combat, boosted by the martial Qatar, and they get a 4+ save against mortal wounds as well, though that's less relevant than it was now devastating wounds don't count as mortals. They've got some nice stratagems as well, including resurrecting Custodes and fighting first, though they're not quite as accessible to them now that they're not able to get as many of them free due to not being battle tactic stratagems. For standout units, perhaps the Adeptus Custodians and the Wardens are the best bets for units to push up, perhaps the Wardens led by Trajan Valoris or the Blade Champion. Caladius tanks do some solid anti-tank work, and they were one of the only things that didn't get nerfed in the last update, and Sisters of Silence and Imperial Agents can be nice to jump around and score objectives. When they're like this though, Custodes really are going to be struggling quite hard. They're generally not an army that tends to have as many clever tricks or plays they can make, generally needing to stomp up to the midfield objectives and hold them against all comers, and they just don't really seem to have the raw numbers to do that at the moment, giving you not that many options to make them work. Otherwise they've got limited range damage outside of Forge World stuff. The Aegis of the Emperor rule not being as effective certainly hurt them, and the squad size changes with the changes to battle tactics definitely hurt their stratagems, particularly their big scary fights first one. Seems like they'll certainly also be in line for some boosts. They could certainly revert some points cost if they wanted to, or change around some of their special rules. It'd be quite nice to have Aegis work against devastating wounds again. Finally, for armies ranked down here, I've also chosen to place the Imperial Knights here again. A pretty similar case to the Custodes, in an army that could stat check other armies quite well at the start of the edition, to now just not really having the raw damage and defense. Their win rate's a tiny bit higher at time of recording at 44%. They've only won the one big event that I've seen since the balanced data slate, and they're kind of medium to lower popularity at big tournaments. When Knights are kind of good in game, they do tend to get played quite a lot more like this. It does seem that not as many people are choosing to put them on the table. For their army rules, they get the Code Chivalric, usually getting some big damage rerolls on very punchy weapons like, say, Armiger thermal spears and combat attacks. If they manage to slay the enemy warlords, they can harvest some CP, and the bondsman abilities for the Questoris Knights can help out Armigers, though no longer the actual big knights themselves. Beyond that, they get a handy feel no pain type save, which isn't too bad for big chunky models that are going to be taking enemy fire, and some solid damage and defense stratagems to back it up, though a few of them cost more CP now. For stronger units, generally you'll need to have a core of Armigers, plenty of Warglaves, and maybe a Helverin or two. For standard datasheets, Canis Rex still seems rather standout, otherwise Crusaders and Wardens are maybe some of the better picks, plus it usually makes sense to have some Imperial Agents on standby, things like Calidus Assassins to dance around and score secondary objectives, or some cheap Inquisitorial henchmen. Perhaps the biggest issues are just the multiple layers of nerfs that they got. They were certainly really strong at the start of the edition, but between the absolute beating they got from stratagem nerfs, Overwatch changes, bondsman ability nerfs, and a whole bunch of points rises, they've gone from really quite strong to very weak indeed. Seems like Games Workshop again could take a bunch of different ways to reversing some of those. I would quite like to see the bondsman abilities come back for the big knights myself, though I guess they could try and help them out by just changing around points cost if they wanted. Knights and Custodes can still be a challenge to handle for certain players at a casual level though. There are armies that tend to bully less optimised lists quite well just with big stats, though given their low win rates at big tournaments and things, it looks like they're just really having trouble even competing against the mid-tier armies at a more competitive level. Moving onward, and with slightly better win rates once more, we've got Tier 5. These are the armies that I'd also consider a bit underpowered in Warhammer 40k, just about limping into Games Workshop's 45% to 55% win rate targets. Though again, I'd rate all of these as still in need of some help from the next balance pass. Here I've chosen to rank Deathwatch Grey Knights, Astra Militarum, and Blood Angels. First up, we'll start with the Xenos Hunters. Deathwatch are an army that seem to have really dropped down the rankings since the latest version of the Space Marine Codex came out. They were doing rather well before that, but took some nerfs to their Black Spear task force, including having the bolt stratagems locked to actual bolt units, and the change to wound rerolls in Oath of Moment didn't help them out too much either. It seems that currently their tournament win rate seems to be around 45%. They've taken down one big event since the balanced data slate, though they do seem to be the single least played faction in Warhammer 40k right now. I certainly expect them to be fairly low down the rankings, but dead last maybe does stand out a bit. For their standard rules, they get the standard Space Marine Oath of Moment, and then they can use whichever Space Marine detachments that they want to at the moment. Some of their big exciting kill teams can be interesting with certain stratagems in various Space Marine ones, though in their standard Black Spear task force they get mission tactics with the damage boosts, and it does also bring some other good advantages, returning to reserve with Teleportarium, and some good enhancements like the Tome of Ectoclades and Beacon Angelis. The Deathwatch don't have a big index, but perhaps some of the most interesting units are the standard Veterans and Proteus kill team, and maybe the Terminators with triple heavy weapons. Most of the rest just feels a little bit on the overcosted side. I guess they'll have special love for bolt weapons out of the Space Marine army, maybe things like Aggressors, which can make good use of their special issue ammo stratagems. For whatever reason though, it doesn't look like many people are very keen to put Deathwatch on the table right now. I do wonder if we might have a bit of a reversal of this, now that other characters can join the Proteus kill team again. That really was holding back probably their best unit in the Codex. Having captains and lieutenants be able to join that and then use big damage combos from various different Space Marine detachments could at least look a bit better on paper. I do feel like most of the other units in the index could probably drop a bit in points though, or get some sort of ability boost. Lots of the kill teams do feel like you're taking quite a lot of miniatures that you might not necessarily want to unlock the big squad with the ones that you do want. Otherwise, we've got the other Inquisitorial Space Marines with the Grey Knights as well. They're on a win rate of around 46%. Two big tournament wins that I've seen since the balanced data slate, and sort of lower middling in popularity, the 18th most played at tournaments. They are certainly an interesting enough army to play right now with their teleport shenanigans, even if they do lack for a bit of damage. Their army is of course all about the teleporting. Everything can deep strike and they can return units to strategic reserve to come down again each turn, and also do that in a number of other different ways with their assault force detachments, with things like the Mist of Deimos or the Sigil of Exigence redeploying things. Grey Knight lists often tend to build around big blocks of Terminators or Paladins backed up by characters, often with some Librarians with a Vortex of Doom to throw around a whole bunch of mortal wounds into the enemy army. Maybe some Purifiers with Castell and Crow to put out the purifying flames and burn down enemy hordes, and maybe a few players taking the odd Dread Knight along to try and handle enemy heavy hitters, though it is certainly a weakness of the index. The main problem is lacking a bit of raw power and might in combat, which maybe is a bit understandable given that they're able to reposition and move around quite so well, but it still seems that Dread Knights just aren't really filling that role well enough for people to take them regularly in the army. Even the Grandmaster one with the big rerolls who he gets once per game. Feels like maybe some small points decreases on some of the lesser played units could still be in order. Having Dread Knights be in a place where they're actually quite good and very tempting to a lot of competitive lists will probably be good for the army overall. Moving on to the Hammer of the Emperor and the Imperial Guard have a win rate of around 45% right now, and they are really seeing a fair share of tournament success with 5 grand tournaments taken since the balanced data slate, though I guess that's in part due to being the 8th most played faction at grand tournaments. For their core rules, they get orders with things like +3 inch to the movement with move, +1 to hits or +1 to saves, often broadcast around by Lord Solar with a command squad. They get lethal hits if they're stationary, which can be quite a nice damage boost, though is perhaps primarily useful for the artillery, as lots of other stuff is going to need to move to get to objectives or get line of sight. And out of the stratagems, they do have some helpful ones for focusing down certain units with damage, though the reinforcement one maybe feels like the most standout, recycling quite big units potentially and putting them back on the field. Can be pretty brutal if you get to use that with a trio of sentinels or armoured sentinels perhaps. While they might not be doing quite so well power-wise, I feel like they're actually really quite well balanced within their codex. There's only a few units that really stick out as being bad. Both flavours of Sentinels are really quite nice. Lord Solar is pretty much auto-include with generating command points. Basilisks and Manticores are both very usable artillery. Plenty of the infantry is handy enough, often Kaschan infantry scouting, sometimes in chimeras. Scions grabbing objectives with deep strike. Gaunt's Ghosts pinging around the table, skirmishing Bulgrins, and plenty of the Rust variants and Rogue or Dawn tanks are quite nice to have on the battle line, though I feel like a few of the cheaper Rust variants are a bit underpowered for what they do. Infantry can still be pretty tanky with big blocks of Death Korps of Krieg and things if you want, and can be a nice option for reinforcement points too. Otherwise though, despite all this, it just seems that it's not really quite coming together for the Guard. Their units tend to just be not really quite powerful enough to overcome the enemy with raw force most of the time, and are actually maybe not the easiest army to really play well. Small mistakes could be a bit punishing if the wrong things wind up in close combat, and needing to use the right orders in the right place, or focal damage buffs to good effect as well, can be quite big. I'd say that Born Soldiers as their detachment rule isn't awful, but it's also not the biggest asset in the world. Lots of stuff generally does need to move around if it wants to actually do well, and it only helps out so much. Overall, I wouldn't be too surprised if they do get some support in the next balance update. There's definitely a bunch of units that do stick out as outright bad, like the Valkyrie and the Death Strike, among others. If they manage to get a bunch more units usable, then that might help out the Guard somewhat. Next up, we've got the Blood Angels, who have a win rate of 45% at the moment, and it's far better with the Gladius than with their own unique Sons of Sanguinius detachment, though they do seem to do Gladius Space Marines at least fairly well, with things like the Librarian Dreadnought being able to teleport around shooting Space Marines and being quite a big asset to the list. More classic jump pack melee Blood Angels doesn't seem to be doing quite so well at the moment though, and not as many people are playing them. It seems that they're the 21st most played in big tournaments out of 26, and as a fairly popular sub-faction, they do tend to get played more than this when they're good. As Space Marines, they get the Oath of Moment, and for their detachment rule as Sons of Sanguinius, they get +1 strength and +1 attack on the charge, though they can make use of the other Space Marine detachments. Gladius does tend to work out better for them these days, with access to easy AP and Lance melee, plus advance and charge for things like Death Company, though they can do well with other strong Space Marine detachments. Ironstorm and Vanguard are both quite nice with them as well. For unique units, I feel like most of them do struggle to break through at the moment. Probably the single best in my opinion right now are the Death Company with Power Fist and Inferno pistols led by Lamartes. He both makes them more dangerous and harder to kill with his -1 damage, and they're really quite fast, tough and threatening. The other really good thing for them I'd say is that Librarian Dreadnought, probably more competitive overall to be honest, but maybe feeling a little bit less classically Blood Angels, more used as a teleport delivery system for shooting units or getting things to objectives where they need to. Otherwise, Bar Predators can threaten a bit of Overwatch, and both the Sanguinary Priest and Dante can be nice enough leader choices, maybe with the Assault Intercessors with jump packs, which are quite cheap. I guess we might see a bit more play of those again now they can actually join the things. For their main issues, I'd say perhaps one of the single most glaring ones is that the Sanguinary Guard are underpowered. They do feel like one of the staple units that really needs to be good to help the faction be good. I guess that Games Workshop might give them a further points drop next time the balanced data slate rolls around, and otherwise Sons of Sanguinius being just a bit worse than the rest of the Space Marine Codex detachment also feels sad. Some sort of rules boost for that would go down very well if Games Workshop chose to give it one. Moving onwards and upwards, and here are the armies that would rank in the lower mid-tier, a bit more solidly within Games Workshop's win rate targets, and perhaps a bit more chance of punching up and winning tournaments for how often they're played, at least when played in their strongest form. A lot of them still feel like armies that have some very weak units and not the best internal balance though, which again could be nice if they could manage to fix them a bit with the points updates coming in January. Out of these, I feel like Space Marines is maybe a little bit more of a complex one given all the sub-faction rankings, and I'm also going for prospectively putting AdMech here, though their new codex's strongest builds haven't really been tested too much in tournaments yet. First up though, let's start with the Dark Angels. Tournament win rates are around 48% right now, though as with the Blood Angels, doing massively better with things like Gladius or Ironstorm compared with their Index detachment with their Unforgiven. Just a lot more strength coming from those compared with the Battleshock stuff. They do seem to be one of the more popular ways to play Space Marines, and have taken 5 big wins since the balanced data slate, which is kind of impressive compared with a few of the other Space Marine chapters. A few of those do tend to be taking kind of minimal Dark Angels units though, often perhaps just Terminator variants, either Deathwing Command Squad or Deathwing Knights, or maybe Azrael. They are seeing a lot of table time at the moment though, the 12th most played in grand tournaments, which is kind of good and pretty middling. I feel like perhaps there is a bit of popularity between Lionel Johnson's release and anticipation of a codex coming up. Plenty of excitement, plus some genuinely strong stuff in an index and a revitalised Space Marine codex. For their actual index detachment special rules, the retaining one objective control, even if you're battle shocked, is okay, will occasionally add up to a few more points. There is a lot more useful against certain armies that trigger it a bit more, maybe things like Tyranids or Chaos Knights. They do have some okay stratagems though, things like returning fire or -1 damage in melee, and the Pennant of Remembrance to make Terminators a bit tougher. As mentioned, I would say for their most standout units, big Deathwing Knight blocks or Terminator command squads are really quite interesting compared with the standard types, either just loads of raw tankiness or things like extra objective control and a built-in champion and reviving a Terminator with the Apothecary each turn. And Azrael's just great to have in a list for just over 100 points, rustling up command points as well as being a genuinely good commander, invulnerable saves and damage boosts, and his own melee profile. Otherwise though, I would say that quite a lot of the other units in their index don't really see as much table time. I've certainly not seen all that many Ravenwing units used competitively in 10th edition, and while Lionel Johnson might have some enormous stats and be very hard to kill, he does cost a perhaps slightly problematic amount of points for that, keeping him out of competitive play for the most part, even if lots of lists might struggle to handle him. Any sorts of boosts for their core detachment would definitely go down pretty well as well. I guess perhaps the data slate isn't really the thing to be looking for them though, given that we know that there's a codex on the way with a bunch of new miniatures and reimagined units, so I guess we'll see what they have in store for them then, I guess we might get things like some specific detachments for Deathwing and Ravenwing, which could be pretty good fun. Also here I've chosen to rank the standard Space Marines. They're perhaps a bit of a weird one when it comes to tournament statistics. Their on-paper win rate is only 46%, though they certainly do win plenty of grand tournaments, usually with the Gladius Task Force or Ironstorm Spearhead leading the way. 8 big wins since the balanced data slate, though that high number of tournament wins maybe isn't all that impressive in the context of being the third most played faction at tournaments currently, though I suppose it would push up to easily the first most played if you counted the divergent chapters in their ranks. In general, I do feel like Space Marines do have a bit of a dilution effect for perhaps newer players tending to play the army a little bit more and dragging down the overall win rate a bit. Plus also a filter effect of really quite a lot of top competitive players that jump around different factions, often just fielding their army as on paper different divergent chapters to make use of certain unique units, maybe being some on paper Black Templars for some bolt-on multi-melters on tanks, or Blood Angels for a Librarian Dreadnought, or Dark Angels for Azrael. Detachment-wise, with their fairly recent codex, there seems to be 4 stronger detachments and 3 weaker ones. The Ironstorm Spearhead and the Gladius Task Force tend to be the most played. For the Gladius, they get their big fire discipline damage shooting combo with aggressors or maybe Hellblasters, plus lots of advance and damage things like advance and shoot or advance and charge. The Ironstorm Spearhead gets you loads of raw power with vehicles, including big damage shooting of their own with their big sustained hit stratagem with Mercy as weakness. The Vanguard Task Force supports shooting infantry for the most part, with a nod towards Phobos. Can be good for teleporting big shooting things around like Eradicators or maybe Centurions. And for Firestorm, it helps you out with a bunch of infantry and transports, perhaps particularly aggressors jumping out of Land Raiders, and perhaps barbecuing things with a bunch of devastating wounds. Overall, quite a lot of good stuff to choose from, and different ways of putting spin on them by running them as different chapters. Space Marines also have the advantage of having an enormous unit roster. For scoring purposes, they've got things like Scouts, Infiltrators, Combi Weapon Lieutenants, and Inceptors. For damage dealing, a lot of their tanks and vehicles will do well. Redemptors, Ballistas Dreadnoughts, Gladiator Lancers, Vindicators, and both flavours of Repulsors. Aggressors jumping out of Land Raiders is a big staple for pushing some big damage up the board, and there's plenty of more usable stuff, things like Eradicators, Blade Guard, Incursors to mark targets, and Storm Speeders. And within the Codex chapters themselves, things like Ultramarines for Marnius Calgar or Uriel Ventris, or Salamanders for Vulcan and Adrax. Overall, perhaps their biggest issues is some competition with certain better divergent chapters stealing some of their glory, perhaps particularly the Black Templars that add a whole load of very powerful units into the mix and are maybe kind of hard to pass up from a competitive level. I do find Space Marines maybe a bit of a challenge to rate though. I think you could have made arguments for them being slightly higher despite their low win rates due to the tournament warpy effects that are talked about, but overall seem to be in not too bad a place. Certainly an army that seems to be capable of winning some very big events around, even if average performance is a bit mediocre. Next up, we have one of the new codexes on the block in the Adeptus Mechanicus. These guys don't really have any big tournament stats yet, given that they've only had 1 week worth of data, and they aren't exactly the most played faction in the world. Prior to the codex drop, they were around about 48% wins. I'd probably guess that it's not going to change too much for this. It could perhaps get a little bit lower in the new codex as they did take some nerfs, but they do have really quite a lot of credible looking options for detachments. It'll be interesting to see which ones tend to win out on the competitive scene. They didn't win anything in the small amount of events that happened last week, and previously they did have very low play rates on their codex. They were the 24th most played codex out of 26 competitively, and while I guess a new codex release would draw a few people to the faction, there's been a lot of doom and gloom around it, so I'm not sure how much. Otherwise, for their rules, their army rule are the Doctrina Imperatives, getting heavier assault and some AP buffs and debuffs, but only on things like the Servitors and on the Skitarii type units. I generally rate the Conqueror one as the more impressive, as it makes them fairly mobile while they're shooting. And their codex has brought a whole swathe of new detachments. At the moment, I'm honestly a little bit wary of predicting which one's going to be one of the strongest ones. Radzone got a bit of a side grade with better bombardments, but getting some of the stratagems and the Omni Sterilizer nerfed. The Hunter cohort has some interesting tricks, but focusing around units that don't deal damage quite as well for the most part. Datus Arm has some interesting boosts and can help out the rather scary Servitors, so perhaps they're not looking too bad. Cybernetica has some direct damage boosts, but maybe a little bit limited support for things like robots and vehicles. And the Explorator does have some good unit boosts, but tends to focus around just 1 or 2 objectives, and you need to pay for more than one with CP. Will be interesting to see how it shakes out between the lot of that. Unit-wise within the Codex though, it doesn't look like there's going to be an enormous amount of build versatility. The initial big winners from the Codex look like their Cataphrone Breachers, which still look rather good. The Sidonian Dragoons and Iron Striders, which seem to just get better if anything, despite being perhaps a little bit pushed before. And now maybe perhaps even more so than before, Vanguard jumping out of transports. Those Doom Riders are rather nice. Support all that with a whole bunch of skirmish units and some tech priests, and I feel like that'll be the core for the majority of army lists. I guess we'll see where the faction falls out on a bit more of a competitive level, though I feel like a lot of people just aren't really too happy with it at the moment. It does still look like they're dominated by a few units and maybe not the ones that people are most excited to play the army with. And it's maybe a bit sad that some of their more cool models and elite infantry aren't really all that threatening and just destined to skirmish with enemy light troops, as opposed to be the mainline damage dealers of the Codex. They're also still looking very expensive to collect, just given that lots of things have low points costs but high money costs, and there still does seem to be a good bit of feels bad that their army special rule only affects a subset of the army, being locked to only the things that can get programmed in by the tech priests. I still expect them to do kind of fine with their best armies and top builds, though I guess we'll wait and see on that front. Next up, we've got yet another army that owns a Codex in the Tyranids. Their win rate's around 47% currently. 4 big tournament wins since the balanced data slate, and given that they're the launch faction of 10th edition, they are very, very popular right now. People are taking them to events regardless, with a number of different army builds, and they're the 4th most played faction in tournaments. Rules-wise, their core rules have their Synapse and the Shadow in the Warp rules, good for a turn of battle shock that can occasionally shock your opponent off some objectives. Can be fairly impactful if there's a Neurotyrant around and you're playing a low leadership army. And then they have really quite a big choice of detachments. I'd say that at the moment the Invasion Fleet, Vanguard Onslaught and Synaptic Nexus are maybe the most general purpose and strong. Unending Swarm can definitely seem to surprise people, and maybe if there had to be an overall winner it would probably be Vanguard Onslaught and the crafty Tyranid shenanigans that you can play with that. Crusher Stampede does seem to be a bit disappointingly underpowered, and the Assimilation Swarm just a bit too limited by certain units, though some people do have some success with it. Otherwise, for more standout units, Death Leaper and Neurolictors seem to crop up in more army lists than they don't, very tanky and dangerous lone operatives in their own way. For damage dealers, Zoanthropes, Exocrines, Maleceptors and Haruspeces tend to do quite well on the front line. Potentially some people use some Norn Emissaries for some feel no pain on central objectives, and otherwise for supporting things, Gargoyles are rather excellent with their move shoot move, and Biovores, Rippers and Pyrovores can provide you some very cheap little units to go around doing secondary objectives. The first two can deep strike things more or less where you need them, and Pyrovores just give you some pretty impressive stats for just the 30 points. Perhaps the biggest issues is that they can often struggle to handle very tough units with higher saves. There's not really all that many weapons in the Codex that can wound vehicles on 3s. And Games Workshop for some reason did just hand out a whole cluster of units, weird points increases for things that were kind of underpowered already. Things like Tyrannofexes, Harpies, the Swarm Lord and Hive Guard and things could all afford to go down by really quite a bit for a bit more internal balance. Doesn't really seem like they're winning events too regularly, but overall pretty playable against the majority of the field and a few interesting different ways to do it right now. Making those weak units good again will be kind of handy though, I think. Lastly, for the Tier 4 armies, next up we have the Chaos Demons, winning around about 47% of games again, and a faction that seems to have been dropping in popularity a little bit. 19th most played in game currently, and only having picked up one big tournament win since the balanced data slate that I've seen. They got a few nerfs and a few buffs, but the buffs didn't really seem to be quite enough to really push people into using lesser demons or the mid-sized demon cavalry type units that much. Their army rule is the Shadow of Chaos, where you try and take some central objectives to push out the shadow, and then that debuffs the enemy and allows your units boosts, including deep striking a bit closer. And perhaps some of their better index rules allow them to do a drop outside of 3-inch stratagem and a return to reserves things, so you can have things popping on and off the table to get the jump on your opponent. For standout units, people generally tend to build around a core of the greater demons for handling big enemy threats and hard targets, often shielded by Be'lakor so they can't be shot at long range turn 1. Then maybe leading things like the very dangerous Shalaxi Hellbane, or things like Bloodthirsters, the Lord of Change, or a Great Unclean One with Feel No Pain. Perhaps some Skirmishing Flamers or Fleshhounds, maybe some Plague Bearers or Horrors of Tzeentch to gum up objectives. Celeste is really quite good for the cost, and Nurglings are pretty excellent and included in quite a lot of Chaos lists. Nice secondary objective doers and infiltrating units to just screen, annoy, and pin back the enemy. Overall, they may be still feeling like an army that isn't quite as exciting to put on the table as they might have been at some points in the past. A few of their good units did have the shine taken off them by a few small points nerfs, and as mentioned, things like Demonettes and Bloodletters probably aren't really at the point where they're looking great to be massively basing an army around. I feel like a lot of the army could probably use some more small points drops if Games Workshop isn't changing anything on rules terms in the next update. Moving onwards and upwards, and now we get into the armies that are considered the upper mid armies of Warhammer 40k. Win rates that seem to be pretty well balanced in the game overall, of around about 49% to 50%, and all of these are taking down at least their fair share of tournaments. Here I've chosen to rank Chaos Knights, Tau Empire, Genestealer Cults, Thousand Suns, Adepta Sororitas, Space Wolves, and Death Guard. First up, we'll start with the Spiky Knights, which might be one of the ones that were towards the top of this list. They've generally been sitting on win rates of around about 50 to 51% for quite a lot of the last few months or so, and certainly far better than the Imperials, languishing further down the table. So far they've won 5 big events since the balanced data slate, and are really quite popular in game at the moment, being the 9th most played army in tournaments, big chunky robots going smash against the enemy. Chaos Knights are the Battle Shock army with Harbingers of Dread, allowing you to debuff leadership and then get further damage and debuff rules from turn 3 onwards, and making all units test if they're in any way depleted can actually be quite impactful on objectives. I've definitely played games where I've lost plenty of objectives due to those rules going off. Otherwise, they do have some handy enough stratagems, including their own version of Rotate Ion Shields, the one to walk through walls, and a -1 AP enhancement that's quite good on big tough knights, and they get access to allied demons like throwing in some Nurglings to help with secondary objectives. Units wise, I would say it's maybe a little bit disappointing for the Chaos Knights at the moment. The vast majority of competitive lists tend to run War Dog spam, often 100% War Dogs, maybe with a big knight or perhaps 2 thrown in if people are feeling generous. And within those War Dogs, the Carnivores and the Brigands really stand out, the dedicated melee and dedicated shooting ones, with Huntsmen and Stalkers both being fine. Out of the big knights, I'd probably rate the Rampager as perhaps the single most effective, given that it's really quite cheap and charges far. The Despoiler and Desecrator are both okay, though odds are if you see a Chaos Knight list that's placed highly at a tournament, there's a good chance that it's running nothing but War Dogs, maybe some allied Nurglings. Overall at the moment though, I'd say they're not in too bad a spot power-wise. A 50% win percentage is pretty balanced, and they can certainly threaten the top dogs. Their morale shenanigans can be a bit random and late game, but doesn't really seem to be working out for them. They do make Battle Shock more relevant than the vast majority of armies out there. I think what will be nice to see though is if they can maintain the same sort of power, but actually bring some of the big knights to the fore. So maybe you might want a list of a couple of big knights plus war dogs as the more sort of standard, rather than nothing but the small guys. Likely some solid points cuts on the big ones would be the way to achieve that, particularly the Abominant, which feels very overcosted at the moment. The Carnivore and the Brigand maybe still feel a little bit on the undercosted side still. Could probably still afford to go up by an extra 5 points or so, and he wouldn't really hurt them. If paired with making the big knights viable, then that could be fine. Next up, for the greater good, we have the Tau Empire, again on a win rate of 50%, taking 7 big tournament wins, and remaining a very popular in game at the moment, the 6th most played in tournaments. I generally argue that they're in quite a good place overall, with a lot of their index interesting. In-game, their primary rule is their greater good boost, where they get to pair their units off for a +1 ballistic skill buff, and then get extra damage boosts from being patient with Cao Yuan until turn 3, picking up some massive sustained hits. They've got an enhancement for early Cao Yuan, a jump shoot jump stratagem, and extra AP with some coordinated fire as well. I'd say their stratagems are maybe a bit on the underwhelming side though. Maybe the jump shoot jumping Crisis 1 might be the most interesting. Otherwise, as mentioned, I feel like compared with most other armies in the game, Games Workshop have managed to make an impressive amount of their units interesting to play. The Ghost Kill's rather spooky as a surprisingly big and shooty lone operative. They've got some good tank busting shooting with broadsides, hammerheads and skyrays, maybe some riptides as some slightly more tanky midfield brawlers. Shadow Sun, Farsight and Crisis Commanders are great, perhaps heading up a mass crisis suit unit with loads of cyclic ion blasters. Tetras are rather godly marker light support, and Kroot, Hounds, and Stealth Suits and Vespids, all pretty goody and useful for running around for objectives. Even things like the Fire Warriors and Devilfish are rather good as well at the moment. There's maybe a bit more scope for creativity than some of the other army lists in 40k right now. Overall, with a fairly balanced win rate and most units playable, they have it better than some. I guess they'll be getting their new codex in the not too distant future. Maybe small criticisms could be things like crisis suit weaponry not being locked to cyclic ion blasters would probably be good. The rest is just a bit underwhelming by comparison. Tetras also feel a bit too mandatory for a kind of niche Forge World unit as well. It'd be nice to reduce the reliance on them. And they do have their more standard faction weaknesses as well, of having to balance pushing up and taking midfield objectives, while not really having too many things that are just massively tanky and durable to do so. So that's kind of their thing as a fast-moving shooting army. Next up, we have the Servants of the Four-Armed Emperor with the Genestealer Cults, again on a 50% win rate and 3 big tournament wins since the balanced data slate. As per normal, they are really quite a niche army in Warhammer 40k without too many people using them. 23rd out of the 26 factions competitively currently. A bit of a die-off there since they got their massive horde mode respawning reined in. That might be for the best though, given that they had a crazy win rate of like 63% with that, so that's been more overpowered than anything currently now. For their core mechanics, they can still respawn things, but just not quite as reliably. More chance for battle line things coming back when they die, or things killed early. When things turn up to the board, often by cold ambush, they get sustained hits 1 and ignores cover, and they've got some nice guerrilla warfare stratagems, redeploying units at the end of the turn, or arriving just 3 inches away from the enemy, or shielding units if desired. They also have the option to pick up some guard datasheets, like maybe a basilisk to slow enemy movement down and things, if they want to take some hints from the Imperial Guard. Otherwise, for standout units within their roster, the Neophyte hybrids and the Acolyte hybrids tend to be the star damage dealers. Neophytes with buffs with seismic cannons can be really quite scary and delete plenty of things. Some combination of the Primus, Ridge Runner AP, and some stratagems may be free from a Nexus. The Acolytes can turn up with that 3-inch stratagem and then throw a bunch of demo charges around for spectacular results. And you could potentially take a big first turn charge unit of Aberrants infiltrated up the board with a character. A few lone operatives are kind of handy to have around, maybe particularly the Reductor Saboteur, which can do a bunch of damage for how much she costs. Otherwise, for issues, they do tend to be at least fairly fragile when the enemy catches up with them, maybe by design really, given the respawning. Fast movers and deep strikers might be able to counter blip markers like Space Marine Inceptors coming down to wipe them out. Big Overwatch units can take big chunks out of them, and you can get some big swings on whether or not units respawn or decides to just remain off the board for the rest of the game. Melee rush lists like Orks seem to do quite well against them, and there's plenty of units in the roster that just don't really feel all that exciting for the cost compared with the battle line stuff. Maybe the Magus, Metamorphs, and the Rock Grinder might be some of the biggest examples. You could probably take some points off those without really affecting overall faction strength. Next up, for another very crafty army, we have the Thousand Suns, again on a win rate of 50%. 4 big wins since the balanced data slate here, and a sort of lower middling popularity faction, 16th most popular in 40k. That does feel sort of in line with where I'd usually expect them given their player rate, to be honest. In game, the Thousand Suns have their core rule with their Cabal of Sorcerers, allowing them access to their favourite psychic spells like Doom Bolt, removing armor saves, or double moving for big effects. And the detachment gives them a little bit of boost to their psychic damage output, with their various sorcerers picking up damage boosting special rules. The spells can be really quite big and impactful, and still have a bit of the big decision making sort of thing that Thousand Suns are sort of known for, knowing when to use them or when to hold back and use something else. That Umbrellific Crystal can be quite nice to teleport a unit round the board, maybe delivering a bunch of Warp Flamers, and the other enhancements are pretty good too in my opinion. In general, Thousand Suns lists tend to be really quite Rubik Marine, led by Sorcerer Heavy at the moment, almost always with Magnus in attendance to lead them. The vast majority of the Sorcerer characters I think are really quite well balanced at the moment, and there's arguments that you can make for most. Perhaps occasional lists losing things like Scarab Occult Terminators or the Mutalith Vortex Beast, or some chaff like Cultists or Zangors. Perhaps for main issues, the Thousand Suns really don't tend to be all that durable or all that fast at the moment outside of movement tricks like the Crystal. Having quite so many of their points cost all tied up in characters that don't tend to be that tough for the points can leave that as a bit of an issue, and with Magnus being such a massive linchpin, if he does get taken down by an opponent with some massive anti-tank shooting, it could cause some big problems. Scarab Occult Terminators I don't think are truly unplayable, but they seem to have really dropped off in terms of competitive use recently, given the points increase and the change to free stratagems that Games Workshop made. and lists maybe do feel a bit hemmed into making things that generate loads of Cabal points with Rubric Marines and Sorcerers, and it might make taking significant amounts of just about anything else as a bit of a bad idea really, as then you won't have a critical mass enough to access those powerful boosts. Still though, they still seem to be doing fairly well for themselves. I'd definitely rather have Magnus powerful than not, and Sorcerer's leading rubrics is rather iconic for the faction, and a 50% win rate is pretty balanced. Next up we have the Sisters of Battle also joining them on a 50% wins, though competitive lists for them do feel kind of weird at the moment to try and get this. They've won 5 big tournaments since the balanced data slate, and are really quite a low played faction at the moment, the 22nd most played in tournaments. They are at least fairly expensive to collect, and again I feel like their top list often really heavily revolving around their armour and other kind of niche units like Arcoflagellants perhaps puts people off them a little bit more than usual. Their army rule is their acts of faith from miracle dice, losing miniatures to gain dice to slot into big rolls like wound or damage rolls from multi-melters, or auto-complete some big charges. Blood of the Martyrs can give them some damage boost when the units are depleted. Those may be a bit more unreliable and reliant on the opponent not fully wiping out certain units, and they do have a couple of useful enhancements that field into their miracle dice games. I feel like they're in a weird space though, where they've got quite a lot of the units that are genuinely quite good. Things like Morven Val, the Triumph, and Celestine are all nice. Seraphim are good for objectives. Arcoflagellants are all rather blendy with their flails. Standard Battle Sister squads do see competitive play as one of the best ways to push Miracle Dice through multi-melters, particularly if the Triumph is nearby. There's loads of use of their armour with things like Castigators, Immolators, and Exorcists, and the Palatine with the Blade of St. Eleanor is quite a common, surprisingly punchy character. However, I feel like that list is missing a bunch of rather important units that Sisters might want to build around a little bit more. Things like Retributors with multi-melters, Sisters Repentia, Zephyrim, or Paragon Warsuits that don't have Morven Val in them, all just feel a bit overcosted for what they do. At least for their previous history, they feel like the units that should generally be the best choices in-game. Hard-hitting but fragile units that can be massive threats, but also maybe not too hard to kill in return. I'd hope that the balanced data slate might be able to even things out a bit by making those a bit better. Even if overall the faction isn't doing too terribly at top tournaments, there might not be all that many people that have the theoretical optimal list with loads of armour that tend to get run. Next up we've got the Space Wolves that again have a win rate of around 50% right now, maybe not taking down quite as many tournaments with that though, with only 3 since the data slate, and again fairly low player rates as they go, 20th out of 26 in 40k right now. Space Wolves seem to be one of the divergent chapters that are doing better than most, and in general they seem to be doing that with Thunder Wolves and largely in the Stormlance task force of the Space Marines, the one that in theory seems to be written for White Scars and biker units, but in reality it has wound up as Thunderwolves the detachment, as Outriders aren't really all that efficient and Thunderwolves really are. Those sort of lists tend to revolve around multiple big units of the Thunderwolves, backed up by their powerful character support options with battle leaders and wolf lords, and occasionally their named characters. Gladius and Ironstorm are just generally strong for the Space Marines, and the Space Wolves have some interesting units to add to that. Again, like a lot of the rest of the divergent chapters though, their Champions of Rust detachment looks very lackey in the numbers compared with the Codex ones, with those sagas that are just unreliable to complete and potentially locking you out of some really important boosts until late in the game. Otherwise, for stronger Space Wolf units bar Thunderwolves, there's Beyond the Fell-Handed as just all-round an efficient dreadnought and helps to ruin one enemy stratagem as well. Logan Grimnar himself is really quite cheap and provides you a turn of big melee rerolls as you get into combat. Cheap scoring Fenrisian Wolves for just 30 points are a big asset. They can run around and do your secondary objectives, and Bloodclaws I think are quite interesting out of their other units. Very cheap high OC Space Marines en masse can be kind of fun with a number of characters, perhaps Ulrich the Slayer being a fun unique one. Overall it seems that the Space Wolves aren't doing too badly right now. I still say perhaps the biggest complaint for them would be that their Champions of Rust detachments just hasn't held up well since it came out. Wolfen as well seem to be very overlooked in competitive lists. OC0 really is a bit of a kicker for them, and while their raw numbers really aren't too bad, only having damage 1 attacks with lowish AP doesn't make them the most exciting. Finally, for the upper mid armies, we've got the Death Guard, who have a nice 7 of 7's 49% win rate right now, with 8 big event wins since the balanced data slate. They've had a big resurgence in people playing them since Games Workshop tweaked their rules around. Getting the extra contagion debuff has been rather nice for them, and they're currently 10th most played at grand tournaments. Their army rules bring the Gift of Nurgle for a -1 toughness aura, with Spregnus Sickness corrupting some objectives, and now of course they get their bonus contagion, either extra AP or an extra -1 to hit up close that you could flex out depending on opponent. I'd say maybe the AP one is perhaps slightly more reliable, but if it's just not super relevant against the army that you're playing, or the -1 to hit will hurt more, it is genuinely something that you could flex. Otherwise, for their unit roster, pretty much most of their iconic stuff is usable. Plague Burst Crawlers maybe seem to be one of the things that's most overrepresented, with 3 of them appearing in really quite a lot of competitive lists currently as some primary range damage dealers with some good barrage fire. Otherwise, Plague Marines and Rhinos are quite good, often with Biologist Putrefiers or some of the rest of the Virion members. Death Shroud plus characters are just all around quite efficient, and the characters that support them are good. Typhus is nice with his Mortal Wound spell, plus he can join some Poxwalkers if you wanted an interesting cheap hoardy sort of unit. Mortarion himself is pretty solid, plus you've got access to allied Nurglings for screening and infiltrate type things or pop up secondary doers. As for issues, they seem to be in a fairly good spot right now, fairly balanced, winning plenty of tournaments, and quite a lot of their unique unit roster all doing well enough. It's perhaps a little bit strange that they're mainly just tough by being kind of cheap as opposed to actually on their raw datasheets though. Plague Marines certainly didn't feel anywhere near as hard to kill as they did in 9th edition. Out of their unique units as well, I'd say the Blightlord Terminators could use some love. They do seem rather heavily outcompeted by the Death Shroud for what they do at the moment. Moving on though, and up to tier 2, this is where I'd rank some of the seriously strong armies in Warhammer 40k, things that are really quite a handful to win against in their most competitive lists currently. Lots of nasty efficient choices. Here I've chosen to rank the new Necrons, Black Templars, Leagues of Votann, Orks and World Eaters. Jumping straight into it, and Necrons are the other new codex on the block. We don't have any sort of tournament data or win rates for them yet, though the initial weekend that they had was rather positive. They got a win rate well above 50%, and they did manage to take home one big tournament already with the Canoptek Court with Mascatan and Wraiths, and I'm sure they'll be hitting the tournament tables in force in the not too distant future. They were the 5th most popularly played army prior to their codex coming out. Lots and lots of people collect the faction given it last edition and Indomitus. Their core army rule are the reanimation protocols, meaning that damaged units gradually repair themselves towards full health. Can be pretty massive when you have something really tanky getting that, like Catan, though perhaps not as easy to stack multiple stacking buffs compared with pre-codex. In the new book they now have 5 different ways to play, I'd say in rough order of power. Those would be Canoptek Court for the big rerolls on Canoptek units, plus Tesla Immortals with devastating wounds. Hypercrypt Legion for teleporting Necron firepower around the board, and that's really nice for getting Catan up close and scary as well. The Balanced Awakened Dynasty with the Generalist one with its command protocols and reactive reanimation stratagem. Obeisance Phalanx building around the Lichguard and Triarch Praetorians. Annihilation Legion with the Scorpec support and no fallback enhancement for a Scorpec Lord. Canoptek Court and Hypercrypts do seem like some of the most straightforward to use though, with a really massive damage boost and some good supporting stratagems, and then some big teleport mobility craftiness with the other. For initial impressions, it maybe doesn't look like the codex is enormously well internally balanced though. Canoptek Wraiths led by Technomancers do seem to be the optimal thing to take the midboard. The Catans seem very hard to pass up with their current stat lines, just enormous feel no pain type saves coupled with massive durability. And then maybe some fast moving or infiltrating units to take objectives, things like flayed ones or tomb blades maybe, or deep striking death marks. And Immortals seem to be fairly solid if you want a good bit of objective control, clearing out hordes really quite well, though they can certainly do a lot more to very tough things with that Canoptek Court devastating wound stratagem. Lots of lists tend to make good use of their massive anti-tank firepower as well, with the Doomsday Cannon things or Locust Heavy Destroyers. At the moment it looks like they're going to be reclaiming their realm in the top echelons of Warhammer 40k. Probably the biggest initial issue looks like the codex just doesn't look very well internally balanced at the moment though. I guess that might even out after Games Workshop's done a balance pass or two. Until then though, it looks like it might well be Codex Wraiths, Catan and support, at least at the highest level of play. Otherwise, for stuff that's maybe a bit more proven and doing very well already, we've got the World Eaters. These guys got some solid points cuts when they needed them in the last balanced data slate and are sitting on around a 52% win percentage in tournaments right now. They're maybe not translating to quite as many wins as some of their peers, with only 4 big event wins since the balanced data slate, at around about a middling sort of play faction. For their core army rule, they get the Blessings of Khorne, roll your 8 dice, and choose 2 buffs that you can get out of the various rolls that you have. Often some of the most exciting could be the Advance and Charge and the +2 to movement. Between that, you could be reaching enemies from a scarily long distance across the board, but when you're closer in, extra damage or defense could help out quite a lot. Otherwise, the Berserker Warband gives everything a bit more oomph on the charge with +1 strength and +1 attack. And again, like the Death Guard, I'd say that the majority of World Eater's unique units are really quite playable in game right now. Angron pretty much the star of the show and fairly also includes the chance just to have him return to the board with a Favourite of Khorne roll that goes in your way is absolutely massive, and you can stack that in your favour with some icons on objectives, plus the Favourite of Khorne Warlord trait. It does usually make sense to have a Juggernaut Lord or something with that around. Otherwise, for good stuff, the Master of Executions with the Berserker Glaive is a really common include, really nice to defend an objective with some Khorne Berserkers in the midfield. Lord Invocatus often shows up, leading a whole bunch of scouting 8-bound up the board. They can scout innately, and then he can make some Exalted 8-bound get the same. That's a lot of Khorne 8 things that can be hitting the enemy front lines turn 1 if you want. Khorne Berserkers and Jackals tend to appear in lesser numbers, having a bit more focus on objectives, maybe jumping out of Rhinos on the Berserker's point of view, and maybe some allied Wardog Brigands could be alright if you wanted some fire support. Overall, I'd say that World Eaters are in a pretty good place right now. They're kind of a bit singular-minded, as you'd really expect them to be, just thrown forward to destroy the enemy as fast as possible, though that is their playstyle. Maybe the Berserkers are a little bit disappointing that they're not a bit more dangerous in their own right versus the 8-bound and things, but they most definitely still have their role in competitive list. Angron's really good fun. I feel like he's maybe just perhaps a touch too auto-include, and he wouldn't really want to be making World Eaters list without him that much. Some games could definitely be wins or losses depending on whether or not he respawns as well, which could be a bit of a coin flip. Overall pretty fast moving, very scary and hyper violent, as World Eaters should be. Next up we've got the Leagues of Votann, one of the highest win rates in the game here with a win rate of 55, 8 big event wins since the balanced data slate, and have certainly been gradually increasing in popularity since 10th came out with their garbage rules at the start of the edition. Very few people were playing them at tournaments then, but now they're around about mid-table, 13th most played of the 26 armies, perhaps not too bad in terms of play rates for an army that's pretty new. Their core army rule is their judgment tokens from Eye of the Ancestors, handing out +1 to hit and wound if you can get 2 markers on one enemy unit, and then that's made very easy as you just get to automatically hand out 4 of those big 2 marker debuffs to your least favourite enemy units on the other side of the board. Really quite powerful for taking down enemy big stuff. They can combine that with a fairly powerful sustained hit shooting stratagem as well that can make one unit just extra dangerous each turn. The army roster is quite a small one and there's not loads of options, though the vast majority of things tend to be pretty reliable. Maybe 4 standouts within the codex, Einhir Hearthguard dropping down with their mixed melee and range shooting. Grav Thunderkin are really quite efficient damage dealers, though can struggle to get in range sometimes. Sagitors are really stand out and perhaps the most spam thing in the army typically. Small units of Hearthkin, Chthonian Berserks, or even just characters sometimes taking up residence. Land Fortresses are pretty good. Most of the characters are nice, though Uthar's probably the weakest of those, and the Hernkin Bikers are pretty fast moving, good skirmishers as well. In general, Leagues of Votann are having a pretty good time of it. A very strong army that a lot of armies can just struggle to deal with the raw damage output of them. It can be a touch short range, but given that lots of lists take heavy uses of the Sagitors and the Land Fortresses, that's not the biggest issue for most of them. And you can put a lot of scary threats on the board between them and things coming in from reserves like the Thunderkin or the Hearthguard. Perhaps the slightly more underwhelming units, the standard Hearthkin and the Chthonian Berserks are perhaps a touch lacking. That might be partly just due to maybe the other stuff being quite so standout though, given that they are really towing the edge of Games Workshop's acceptable limits. I really wouldn't be too surprised if they do see some points nerfs as a reaction to quite such good tournament performance here. Next up we have the Orks, a little bit lower than the Leagues of Votann for win percent at 52%. They have been taking down a few more tournaments with 10 big wins since the balanced data slate, though I feel like that's probably just due to having a bigger player representation. They're pretty popular currently with the 7th most played army at tournaments, so that probably accounts for the difference there. Rules-wise, Orks go very heavily all in for the melee at the moment, with their War rule giving them a massive turn of advanced charge, melee buffs and invulnerable saves, and when they get to combat they get extra hits on 6s from their War tribe special rule. Otherwise, the rest of the support of the detachment feels very Goths. A -1 to wound stratagem helps alongside plenty of wounds and chunky toughness profiles, and a couple of other ones for either getting to melee or dealing damage when you're there. As a result, perhaps unsurprisingly, the exciting stuff is the combat stuff right now. Things like knobs, beast snaggers, maybe mega knobs and squighog boys. The standard boy is led by either war bosses or beast bosses, and the knob on the Smasher Squig is rather brutal with that relic chopper to take down big monsters or vehicles. Gretchen are excellent value at their massively tiny points cost to farm objective control and get more CP. The Squigosaur bosses and Mozrog Scragbads seem to be really common staples in army lists as well. Trucks are still remarkably efficient for what they do, and Badrock with flash kits jumping out of a truck is about the one contribution of Orky Daka to competitive lists at the moment. They can put out some pretty hefty close range shooting. Overall, Orc melee rush lists do seem to be doing rather well, though they do feel very singular playstyle right now for an army that's got lots of different themes going on. Things that tend to build around Orky armoured damage dealers like the Buggies, Walkers and Planes just tend to be left in the dust. It might just partly be due to just not having a detachment that really supports Daka sort of Orc armies currently. Maybe they'll get them in the upcoming Codex in spring, but currently quite a lot of the data sheets just feel a bit underwhelming for what they do right now. Otherwise, tough tanks with high saves can cause more issues for Orcs than most, with only a few specific units being really quite efficient against killing those, certain beast snagger things maybe being at the forefront. Finally for tier 2, we have the Knightly Space Marines of the Black Templars. I feel like these guys really are kind of hard to beat at the moment for the Space Marines, basically just feeling like standard Space Marines but with better units and also quite a credible unique detachment as well. They've got a big win rate of 55% and have won 7 big tournaments since the balanced data slate, certainly holding their own there as well. And not doing too badly for an army that's slightly lesser played, at 15th most popular out of the 26. They definitely have risen up in player rate a bit since they got good though. This represents them on a good day for the number of collectors they have. As Space Marines, they get the Oath of Moment rerolls, and they have both access to the Righteous Crusaders detachment as well as the rest of the Space Marine ones. The Righteous Crusaders often gets used for the 6+ Feel No Pain type save, unless one of the melee boosts makes a bit more sense, and has a few nice combat support stratagems such as a chance to prevent fallback and Tannhauser's Bones to give a big Primaris Crusader squad a 5+ Feel No Pain. Otherwise, they can really do the Ironstorm Spearhead very well as well, not only having just some very powerful unique units to support it with, but basically getting their own versions of the Primaris tanks where they pay very little for the multi-melter to go on top, usually an extra 5 points, and in a detachment with access to big rerolls, that's quite a big upgrade over the Stubbers that they tend to replace. Otherwise, just about every unit in their small index is rather good in-game. Standard Crusader squads are very cheap for the bodies that you can put on the board and do fine in melee. The Firstborn Crusader squads might be arguably even more strong for the cost, a 65-point squad for a Marine squad and power armor with OC2, a special weapon and a las cannon in the unit. That's great in Ironstorm with the rerolls. Sword Brethren can deal some massive damage in melee if you just want some elite damage dealers jumping out of a Land Raider. Helbrecht and Grimoldus are both good, Grimoldus giving his 5+ Feel No Pain amongst other things, and as mentioned the multi-melter tanks are pretty standout in their own right, pretty well flatly better versions of already good vehicles. Overall, between all that, they do seem to be the Marines to beat currently. 2 strong main builds and able to do other things with Gladius and Vanguard as well. I feel like overall between all that it probably is going to get some small points increases. I feel like both their Crusader squads and their multi-melter tanks will be absolutely fine if they went up slightly. It might just be a bit more in proportion with their abilities versus the rest of the standard Space Marine stuff. Finally, we get to the very top tier armies of Warhammer 40k, and while the last two might not be crazily ahead in terms of win percentage, they do seem to be hooving up the vast majority of tournaments at the higher end of play, and here we have the scary Aeldari and the powerful Chaos Space Marines. Starting out with the Chaos, and they've got a win rate of 55% in game right now, so kind of similar to a few of the others, but they just seem to be massively better for actually winning tournaments. 21 big wins since the last balanced data slate, slightly over double what the rest of them have. They are the second most played in grand tournaments, both being popular and very strong at the moment, but that doesn't quite explain the tournament overperformance. They still win a lot for how many people play them. For how they get there, the Chaos Space Marines get some pretty standout damage dealing core rules. Their systems of Dark Pacts plus Chaos Marks mean they can get some very big sustained and lethal hits on any unit as a pop-up. Pretty spectacular damage boost that on most of the mainline damage dealer units are well worth the chance of D3 immortal wounds from time to time. And then depending on the god mark as well, you get access to some seriously powerful stratagems on top of that. Things like the Nurgle one that can stop you being shot at greater than 12 inches for protecting a key unit from enemy shooting, or the full rerolls undivided one where you get to casually reroll all hidden wounds against your target, which is just enormous for raw damage output. For standout units chosen with Chaos Lords are a staple, massively fighty between the Lord's boosts, free stratagems, and often the undivided mark stratagem, all loaded into Nurgle Rhinos to shield them from view. Forge Fiends and Obliterators are perhaps the most exciting of the range damage dealers, putting out really good damage with the Nurgle mark, or Chaos Undivided and full rerolls again if needed. Warp Talons are really stand out, particularly with Mark of Slaanesh, where you might be able to advance and charge them, and then just a whole load of buckets of hits when they get to melee to shred enemy infantry. Accursed Cultists and Dark Communes are really strong, okay damage and enough toughness for the points, plus lots of objective control. And I can access Nurglings for some infiltrate and secondary things, or Celeste or Lone Operative type demons to help with scoring a bit more. Overall, definitely a massively scary army to face that will almost certainly have the damage output to destroy whatever you've got in most of their optimized lists. I guess for weaknesses, provided you can actually damage them, they don't tend to be the most durable per cost once exposed, and they have quite a lot of their things reliant on their stratagem tricks to be able to get good damage output, though with some Chaos Lords you can often get a few more of those than you might do otherwise. Overall very scary, and seemingly the second most powerful army in Warhammer 40k right now. A great win rate with loads of big tournament wins. Between all that, it certainly seems like they're in line for some further nerfs. I suspect it might well be more points increases as opposed to rules changes, though we'll wait and see. I guess it's not impossible Games Workshop could go out after one of those really big stratagems like the Nurgle or Undivided one, as another source for potential nerfs for the army. Finally, last and greatest within Warhammer 40k right now, and perhaps to no one's surprise, we have the Aeldari. Tournament win rates of 58%, 34 big wins since the balanced data slate, and the single most popular faction to play in Warhammer 40k tournaments these days, only slightly ahead of Chaos, but given that Chaos Space Marines have far more players in general than Aeldari, they do seem to have been quite thoroughly embraced by the competitive scene, given for how they've been so strong for so long at the start of the edition. They're nowhere near as far ahead as they used to be at the edition launch, but they do seem to be the standout army on all major metrics. For their army rules, they get their Strands of Fate, allowing you to sub in Fate dice into rolls, maybe making some of them auto 6s with Farseers if needed, but that can just be very big for getting, say, some automatic devastating wounds, or just getting some big damage through with high power anti-tank weapons that they have, or bouncing some key attacks off invulnerable saves. Their Battle Host rerolls allow you to reroll one hit roll and wound roll when each unit attacks, which is enormous with Bright Lances or any other hard-hitting attack, and then they pair all that with a lot of stratagems that tend to focus around movement and redeploying things. Lots of good supporting type ones, though their Phantasm one allowing them to move an infantry unit reactively in the opponent's turn can just be enormously disruptive and really put the opponent on the back foot. Then for their list of units, they have probably more viable top tier units than just about any other faction in the game. Lots of good stuff within the index, and there's plenty more usable stuff beyond this. Night Spinners are in just about every competitive list, slowing down enemy units rather painfully, as well as doing good indirect fire support, maybe with a Farseer to boost them. To take central objectives, there's often a big stompy unit of Wraithguard with a Spirit Seer moving up the board. The Spirit Seer can take Fate's Messenger to allow them to cancel some failed saves and get some big damage through. And they're a pretty amazing focal units to use any focal character buffs or stratagems on. The Incarn's really awesome and teleports around the board when things die. The Avatar of Kane's great. Things like Hornets, Fire Prisms or War Walkers for dedicated anti-tank with big rerolls work well. The Autarch Wayleaper is a nice lone operative that can go around farming up command points. There's plenty of options for fast units on objectives, things like Shadow Spectres, Warp Spiders and Swooping Hawks, depending on which ones you fancy and how many points you want to invest. And otherwise good support from things like Illican Rangers with lone operative style protection, plus some fairly good sniping damage, or other lone operatives like Death Jesters or Solitaires, or Fugan who can pair well with Farseers. And his respawn when he dies special rule means that he doesn't even really need lone operative type protection or a bodyguard. Between all that, they've got a whole load of things. that can hit you while you'll struggle to hit them back, Stormy Wraiths to take the centre of the board, massive damage dealers with anti-tank type things, and plenty of objective grabbing stuff. There's a lot to fear. Weaknesses wise, they perhaps tend to be a bit weaker to anything that can catch up with their more fragile units, maybe hit things hard that are quite a long way away. Things like Genestealer Cults or melee rush armies like Orks tend to do well, or things that can teleport around the board like Grey Knights. Besides things like Avatars and Wraithguards, a lot of the units are at least fairly fragile when you can catch up to them if you can, and a bit of indirect fire on the go probably doesn't hurt to have either. Overall, seems kind of inevitable that they're going to scoop up a fair few more nerfs with this kind of performance. I'd guess most likely some further points increases to some or all of this list. Probably won't need to be anywhere near as punitive as last time though to get them a bit more back in line. At least they're only 3% above Games Workshop's 55% target, as opposed to 14% as they were before. So anyway, with Aeldari and Chaos talked about, that brings to a close a great big tier list of Warhammer 40k armies and their power in 10th edition. Let me know what you think of the rankings and whether or not you would have rated anything higher or lower. Look forward to hearing all your thoughts down in the comments below as always. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new stuff just about every day. And finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and that's the main way that I can keep on making big long projects like this just about every day, and keep all these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early from time to time, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.